Is violence against women universal? Well, yes it is. Violence is part of human history. It has always existed, and unfortunately, it always will. Biologists cite the male testosterone hormone as the reason why men are more violent than women. And violence against women has been accepted and even condoned throughout much of human history. That's all obviously true. There are also obvious differences, though, between the ways that societies treat domestic abuse and the way that we treat perpetrators of this violence against women. After I wrote a recent column on a Syrian man in Canada who beat his wife with a hockey stick for half an hour, well, I was accused of all kinds of thought crimes by the leftist thought police. Here's one example. So-called conservative MP Deepak Oprah. He said this: "Domestic violence has no culture. It exists even today in Canadian society. Let's concentrate on fighting it." Well, yes, I agree that violence is part of human nature and male biology. It may exist everywhere, but not in the same way and not on the same scale. In civilized societies where men are raised with honor and dignity, where they're raised to be gentlemen, violence against women exists a lot less. Here's the data on domestic abuse in Canada. So the rate of spousal abuse across Canada in 2015 was 309 incidents for every 100,000 Canadians over the age of 15. That works out to be about 0.3% of the population. Now, if we want to isolate to only cases against women and only about women, it goes up to about 482 cases per 100,000, or less than 0.5%. So yes, every case is a tragedy, but it's far from prevalent in our society. And more so, the punishment for domestic violence in Canada is steep. Alongside possible jail time, perpetrators pay a heavy social cost, being labeled as a wife beater. In Canada, we should certainly commit to lowering that number. If you're a woman and you're being abused, you need to speak out. If you know a man who beats his wife, speak out. Let's put a stop to all domestic abuse in Canada. And to Deepak's point, yes, it does exist in Canada, but it is not as prevalent here as it is in other parts of the world. One of the very reasons that we know it's not as prevalent in Canada is because police keep track of the data. Well, in other parts of the world, specifically in Islamist countries, police and government officials don't bother keeping track of these figures. In many parts of the world, it isn't even a crime, so why would they bother keeping track of it? So if we want to understand the phenomenon of domestic abuse and its prevalence in other parts of the world, for instance, maybe among Syrian refugees, we can only rely on media reports, on third-party studies, and on our own common sense. Let's look at the Syrian example. Here are just a few recent headlines about Syrians in Canada. The Huffington Post reports, "Syrian women are disclosing domestic abuse regularly," says agency. The Toronto Star has a report that says, "One Syrian refugee a week reports being a victim of domestic abuse," agency says. And here's something from the state broadcaster reporting, "Syrian women coming forward with domestic violence allegations, group says." Now, these are all left-wing publications in Canada. And here's something else from the leftist publication in the UK. The Guardian says, "Rape and domestic violence follows Syrian women into refugee camps." Here's the New York Times in Europe saying, "On perilous migrant trail, women often become prey to sexual abuse." And here's another one from the Times. "Domestic violence on the rise among Syrian refugees." Now, this story mentions that there was a first and only countrywide domestic violence survey in Syria, which was sponsored by the United Nations Development Fund for Women, and it found that between 10 and 25% of Syrian women had experienced physical violence. But the story suggests that the number is probably even higher than that. Here's a quote from the story. "As thousands of refugees continue to pour across the Turkish, Jordanian, and Lebanese borders, experts working there say that the displacement has triggered a shift in traditional family dynamics, leading to a rapid escalation in domestic violence." Here's a quote from a doctor in Beirut saying it's definitely on the rise. That's a doctor who works with Syrian refugees. So possibly upwards of 25% of Syrian women are found to be the victim of domestic abuse. And in Canada, it's less than 0.5%. 1 in 4 Syrian women are abused. In Canada, it's less than 1 in every 200. The difference here is more than just an order of magnitude. But even more than that, there is evidence that this behavior is permitted and even condoned in some Muslim communities and in Arab countries. Here's a Palestinian leader giving wife-beating tips on Gaza TV. Here we see a Saudi therapist advising men on how to beat their wives, and this was aired on Saudi Arabia's state broadcaster. Here in the United Arab Emirates, we see the top court has ruled that men are allowed to beat their wives and children. And here is a video from Sydney, Australia of 2 Muslim women from a hardline group saying that men are allowed to hit their wives if they disobey them, and calling domestic violence a beautiful blessing. Seriously, it's really, really gross. They even talk about how it is permitted in Islam to hit women with sticks. So you are allowed to hit your wife with a stick. Well, they probably weren't talking about hockey sticks, but hey, I guess if you're a Syrian in Canada, you can improvise. Look, I'm not saying that all Syrians are violent. I'm not saying that all refugees are violent. I'm not saying that all Muslim men are violent. Obviously, those things are not true. Obviously, there are good people and there are bad people. There are civilized people and there are uncivilized people all over the world. This video is not trying to generalize, but my point is this. Some Syrian men do beat their wives. And looking at the data, it appears to be more prevalent and more of a concern in this community. It's also true that some Muslim leaders tell their followers to beat their wives, and that powerful and influential Muslim countries air these messages through their official state broadcasters. So why is it that Canadian liberals and leftists insist that we lie to ourselves, that we ignore these statistics, and that we ignore our lying eyes when it comes to the prevalence of domestic abuse in the Syrian community? Well, we shouldn't. When we bring in refugees from places like Syria, we should make a few things very clear. We should say, in no uncertain terms, that in Canada, you cannot beat your wife. In Canada, we consider men who beat their wives to be the scum of the earth. Also, let's tell them that if you do beat your wife in Canada, you're going to go to jail. You'll lose your welfare benefits, and you're likely going to have a very difficult time finding work and making friends. Let's make sure that we tell every single newcomer to Canada, through a trained interpreter if necessary, that Canada does not tolerate spousal abuse. Rather than trying to draw some moral equivalence here, we need to stand up for our Canadian values. But instead, unfortunately, these so-called progressive leftist men, including our own immigration minister, who, by the way, he said that sharing my article was as despicable as beating your wife. As despicable. Talk about a moral equivalence. Well, these liberal leftist men are whitewashing spousal abuse and trying to say that it's racist to even talk about this issue. They believe making an argument based on facts is racist, so long as those facts make a Syrian refugee look bad. They're putting a leftist open border ideology ahead of the truth, ahead of the well-being of Syrian women, and ahead of Muslim women all over the world. Those are facts, and facts are not racist. For The Rebel, I'm Candace Malcolm.